the creative journey. It's easy to get lost, but don't worry, you'll lift off. Sometimes you just need a creative pep talk.
Is it just me, or did you get serious about making stuff partially because you loved creative work that just had a really strong sense of creative voice? Like, that was a huge driver for me. I just became so obsessed with that feeling that you get when you encounter art that feels like meeting a person on a deeper level than you can feel when you meet someone just face to face. Like, I wanted to figure out how to do that. If you want to figure out how to do that, today is a good day for you, because today on the show we have someone who I think has an incredibly powerful sense of creative voice, and it's Caldecott winning author and illustrator Brian Selznick. You might know Brian Selznick's work from books like The Invention of Hugo Cabret, which became the movie Hugo, or some of his other books like Wonderstruck, The Marvels, Kaleidoscope, and many, many more. It's a complete honor to get to speak to Brian as a big fan of his work. And on today's episode, we discuss his new book, and we kind of use it as a specimen to explore who he is as an artist, how he developed this very unique and authentic way of working that also continues to grow throughout his creative journey. His new book, Run Away With Me, is a YA illustrated novel, and it's about two teenage boys falling in love in Rome. And I love the book, and I think this conversation has so many different takeaways for people that want to develop their creative voice or get a stronger sense of that in their work, because this is just someone who I think is a complete master in that area. Stick around to the end for our creative call to adventure inspired by this chat. It's called Timepiece, and it's a prompt that can help you see your connection to your creative heroes, as well as take the pressure off needing to compete with them. So stick around for that. First of all, we could just start with, people might know you from Wonderstruck or Hugo Cabret, but you've been publishing books. I think I read your first book was in 1991. Is that correct?
Yes, the Houdini box.
Yeah, and there's also like a through line from what I can tell. This was a picture book, right?
It was a 48-page picture book, yes.
Yeah.
Unusually long picture book.
Can you tell us just a little bit about that book?
Yeah, it started off as a project I did in college. I went to RISD, very much Rhode Island School of Design, not wanting to be a children's book illustrator. And so I avoided taking any classes with the teachers there, like Chris Van Allsburg and David McCauley. But I did have a sculpture class my freshman year, and we had to do something about the magician Houdini. And I made a three-dimensional image of Houdini on stage with plexiglass. And I just wrote a story to go along with it, because I like writing stories. And it wasn't until after I graduated college that I decided to get into children's books. And then I remembered that story I wrote. And even though it wasn't written for kids, it was about a 10-year-old boy who was obsessed with Houdini like I was when I was a kid. So I took that, rewrote it, made it a bit longer, did about 8 sample illustrations, all with Bic pen, and Xeroxed everything. This was, way before people were using the internet the way we use it now, way before social media. So I got a book from the library called Children's Book Publishing with the addresses and names of editors and publishers.
Yeah.
I Xeroxed everything I had made. I put them in report covers like in high school, and wrote a letter saying, "Hi, I would like to illustrate books. Here's a sample of something I can, that of what my work is like, of what I can do." And eventually, the story ended up in the hands of Anne Schwartz at Random House at Knopf, and she published it. I had originally been contacted by an editor named Arthur Levine, who many years later went on to publish the Harry Potter books. But he wanted me to turn this into a 32-page picture book. And I, even though I was unpublished and living in my parents' house after college with no money, had a very clear idea that this needed to be a 48-page book. I explained to him why. And he said that he wouldn't publish it unless it was for 32 pages. So I turned him down. Wow. I said no to him. Yeah. Looking back, that I realized how gutsy that was. But Ann Schwartz eventually said yes. And the book came out in 1991 while I was still working at a children's bookstore in New York City called Eeyore's Books for Children.
That's great. And I want to get to later talking about format, because that seems important to you. And you've done so many interesting things with that. But first I wanted to ask, like, could the 1991 you see a path leading to this book that you just made, or would this have surprised you?
This would have shocked me. Okay. Like there was so much about this that would have shocked me.
Yeah.
I was 26, I think, when this book was published, when the first book was published, The Houdini Box. I think I had just come out to my parents, or was just about to come out to my parents. I was about 26. A lot of my friends knew already. I'd started coming out after, like, a little late in college, and then after to my friends. And I was not particularly out publicly, although I wasn't seeing anybody, so it didn't really feel like I was hiding anything, per se. But I think I was still existing within a lot of the shame and fear about being queer that I had grown up with. So trying to imagine this book would have really seemed unimaginable at the time. In fact, after I had made about 4 books, after the Houdini Box, I made books for about 6 years that nobody ever read, but I liked them.
Yeah.
And I do remember a friend of mine who's a gay artist asked me if I thought that my books were queer, or if my work was queer. And I said no, because there were no characters who were actually gay in any of my stories. But he laughed in my face and said, "Brian, your first book was about a kid who's obsessed with being able to escape from things like closets." And
wow.
Interesting. And I got his point.
Yeah.
And of course, everything we do is, I do believe, is a kind of self-portrait.
Sure. I agree completely.
So the idea that all of my work is queer, even when there isn't anything specifically queer, just simply because it's mine, made sense. And it's all based on what I, learned in terms of how to see the world, how to understand the world, and the ways in which that shifted and changed over time.
Yeah, I didn't want to presume, but I was guessing, publishing in 1991 was not the same landscape that we find ourselves in, where you would have felt, even independent of your own journey, whether you would have felt good about publishing work like this, and whether it feels like, I wonder if it feels like kind of celebratory, or is it a better future in that way than you imagined?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it also just simply wouldn't have crossed my mind.
Right.
That I write about the characters who come to me, and generally over the past 35 years, the characters who have arrived in my imagination are around 10 to 13 years old.
Yeah.
And this was the first time I even thought of a story about 16-year-old people. So it just simply wasn't anything that was on my mind, in my landscape, on the horizon. And I was very aware of books with queer content. In 1990, I believe Francesca Leah Block published Weetzie Bat, which I discovered in 1991 when I was, actually maybe she published it in 89.
Right.
But in the early 90s, I discovered it when I was working at Eeyore's Books for Children. And it was published as a young adult book. And as a 5-year-old, I thought I was beyond, I wouldn't have identified myself as the young adult reader, because I think we tend to think of that more for teenagers or as teenagers. But, I was a young adult.
Oh.
And that book, which had queer characters whose lives were just a part of the story, and it talked about AIDS without ever mentioning AIDS, because we all knew what AIDS was at the time. It was the height of the AIDS crisis. And it was set in Los Angeles with a somewhat magical fairy tale point of view. Although nothing magical happens, it feels magical, which has remained very interesting to me. And that book was very important to me, but it was definitely one of the few books that were published without gay, proud characters in it.
Yeah.
And I'm very good friends with David Levithan, who's also an activist and a editor. He edited, the Babysitter Club books and the Hunger Games. And now he is editing my work. And, when he published his first young adult queer novel, Boy Meets Boy, about 20 years ago, he said that he was one of about 8 authors who were publishing books, and a very, very small number of books were being published. And now it seems as if dozens and dozens of books with queer topics are coming out all the time.
Yeah.
And despite the enormity of the censorship and all of the issues that we are facing, David Levithan, who's one of the founders of Authors Against Book Banning, which is a really great organization that you can look up and find, really great help in terms of how to fight what's going on, points out that given the number of books and given the size of the community that has been created over the past 20 years, that you can make our lives worse. You can try to censor us, but we are not actually going away.
Yeah.
And that is very different than it was 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago. And so the size of the fight is worse. It is bigger,
sure,
but the size of the supporting team is also exponentially larger.
Yeah, I think that's true. I want to go back a little bit. I'd like to hear if you could just kind of tell people what the book is about. And I'd also like to hear a little bit about the thing you sped by, which was this thing that not magic or is magic or feels magic, but nothing magical happens. I think that's really interesting. As a kids book maker myself, I think about magical realism versus fantasy. And a lot of my books are actually kind of trying to capture the magic of life, because I actually, for the longest time as a kid, was very obsessed with like only fantasy, because I found our world boring. And so it was over time that I learned to see all the magic of life. So if you could just like maybe talk a little bit about what that means to you, and then also tell us a little bit about the book.
Yeah, I'll start with the question about magic,
Sure,
because it is interesting and something that's always on my mind.
Yeah.
And I also, as a kid, mostly read fantasy and some science fiction and lots of horror. I love Stephen King. I love Peter Straub. Ghost Story was one of my favorite books when I was young. And then, when I wrote, even though I didn't consider myself a writer, I wrote stories about underwater cities and horses with wings and horns and children who could fly, things like that.
Yeah.
And I was obsessed with Houdini as a young person, and a lot of people ascribed magical abilities onto Houdini because he was also very interested in the afterlife and in spiritualism. And he was a famous debunker of fake spiritualists. But a lot of people, including myself, believe that the reason he was so adamant about debunking spiritualism was because he believed in it and wanted to find someone who was really doing it so that he could contact people he lost, especially his mother. Although he never did find anyone who
that's really interesting.
Yeah. But, to whom he could, who he trusted.
Yeah.
He debunked everybody.
Yeah. Wow. That's a very interesting story. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And he always said, what I can do, anybody can do. It's just, I'm the only one who knows how. Like, I'm the one who has the secrets. And so so my first book, as we were talking about, the Houdini box, is about a kid who's obsessed with Houdini and the idea that Houdini could escape from anything. And I think part of why Houdini is someone who we still talk about, who's still a metaphor that we all understand, is because he wasn't just doing magic tricks. He was tapping into something very human. We all feel trapped by something. You don't have to be a young queer person to feel like a man who can escape from anything is a metaphor that you want to be a part of.
Yeah.
we all have things we want to escape from that we feel like we can't. And he's saying, you know, in a metaphoric fashion, you can.
Yeah.
And it really wasn't, and I did write, you know, my second book was called The Robot King, which is about two children who build a robot out of scraps from around their house. And they put their mother's music box inside for its heart, and it comes to life. And that has a, you know, kind of sci-fi magical realism element to the story. But generally, I found myself more interested in stories that leaned more realistic. And ultimately, when it was time to start writing The Invention of Hugo Cabret, I remember very consciously reading a book. I won't name what it was, but the premise was incredibly enchanting. And it was set in the real world, in a real city that I really loved. And it really felt magical, the way in which the characters played out within this real city. And then about halfway through the book, actual magic is introduced for the first time. And the whole feeling of magic fell apart for me. And I remember thinking that when I write the story that eventually became The Invention of Hugo Cabret, that I wanted to maintain a sense of magic, a feeling that anything is possible, but that it all happens within the real world with things that are capable of happening. And it involves several coincidences, and, you know, coincidences are, you know, can be controversial to talk about within fiction because you as the author are making them happen so they can.
This is one of my questions actually, but well, yes, keep going. Sorry.
Yeah. Except in real life, I experience extraordinary coincidences, as do many of us, all the time.
Yes.
And they often usually happen when I'm working on a book. And they help me not only do they actually help me figure out what I'm doing, but they feel like markers on a map that are pointing me in the right direction or that indicate I'm going in the right direction.
Yeah. We'll just go there real quick and then we'll, you know, circle back, because this is one of the questions I had was synchronicity or coincidences are a common theme for you. And I think it's one of the things that is so interesting about your books is that you even have people out there like Pixar. One of their rules is like only coincidences that hurt the characters can be included. That's the only ones they'll allow. And I thought, yeah, your books are a really interesting contradiction to that in a way that feels magical, that feels like real life. And I don't know anybody that if they, you know, it's the biggest skeptic. If they have a big enough coincidence, they're going to at least pause, even if they're going to write it off to probability or whatever. They are one of the things that make meaning for us as we move through life. And I think you do a really good job of using that as a tool in a way that you don't see very much. And I'm glad you brought it up, because I wondered how intentional that was, or what you think, what does it do for the story or for the reader?
I mean, for me, it's just realism.
Yeah.
And,
it is.
and so it's a matter of figuring out what the story is. Cause I also don't know what the story is when I begin a project. I have a sense of a character and an age and a place. And I have I often have a couple of moments within a story, but the 3 to 5 years that it often takes me to make a book, are taken up mostly by trying to simply figure out what happens in the plot.
Right.
And so the coincidences that happen because I feel like they need to happen for the characters at this time or that time. And yeah, I remember someone once said, and like maybe it was a version of the Pixar rule, but it was that coincidences can get a character into a plot, but they can't get a character out of a plot, plot problem.
Yeah.
And, that's interesting. That makes sense. But I'm very touchy with anything that paints itself as a rule, because that immediately makes me feel like, well, then then break it. Like you can break it.
Yeah.
And like you don't want to do certain things all the time, and you don't want to, but I feel like anything can work if it works for that particular story with that particular character, with that particular set of circumstances, which will never have been written about before because you're making them up, even if you're using elements or tropes or whatever the word is from the whole history of literature that comes before you, because we're all writing, in a certain moment in time with a certain history of work behind us. And we're trying to figure out how to tell our own stories and thinking about the ways in which I'm interested in the ways in which the stories from the past can help us figure out what it is that we're doing. So I don't have any rules about anything.
Yeah.
It's just that I'm not afraid of things like coincidences. I don't set out to avoid anything. If I notice that it seems unrealistic within the world I'm creating, this kid just had this happen, so it wouldn't really feel logical for this then to happen. Like that's an instinct that exists within the story.
Mm-hmm.
And I then try to follow the story. But I don't know, like if I really needed two coincidences to happen in a row, my job would be to figure out how to make those believable for this character, for this moment. And, I've had a lot of experience with seeing or helping to translate my work into other media.
Yeah.
Books to movies, books to theater. And I have noticed that one of the things that the adapters have to deal with, even if the adapter is me, is how to handle the coincidences that in a book might feel normal or natural or believable, where on stage or on film, where things have to unfold in a different way, they then might feel unrealistic.
Yeah.
So, if there's 3 coincidences in the book, when I'm adapting or when it's being adapted, there may in fact only be room for one.
Right.
And, but, so much about adaptation from book to another medium is about whittling down and,
sure.
and cutting. But maybe for me, it's more about not having any preconceived notion about what something should be.
Yeah.
It's what does this story need? And then trying to allow space for that to happen.
Do you have a sensitivity to coincidences in your life more than other people potentially?
I don't think it's more or less than other people. Because I don't know everybody.
Sure.
But all I can say, I've met a bunch of people. They're very interesting. But in general, I am very aware that I have these major coincidences happen. And they sometimes make me feel like, even though I don't believe in a kind of omnipotent God,
sure,
it makes me feel like I understand why people do.
Right.
Because it's weird. Like there are weird, big things that happen. And the idea that something is making that happen for you is pleasing. Like that's a really pleasing idea.
Yeah.
But if I don't believe in God, I do like the idea that there is something that makes sense of the universe. Einstein talked about this, sort of bigger idea that everything makes sense. It's just that we can't understand it because we're just who we are.
Yeah.
And so that's interesting to me. And I'm also fine living in a mystery. I also don't need answers to everything. That I find the mystery really pleasing and exciting. And I think I also want to give that to my characters a little bit so that my characters can offer it to the reader, where sometimes just living in the unknown is okay.
Yeah.
And my plots tend to be mysteries where the character in the beginning doesn't know something. They want to know something. They eventually meet someone who knows everything. And then that person tells them a really big story. I didn't do this on purpose, but I have noticed that this is a structure that my stories sometimes follow.
Yeah.
But each time I get there in a different way. The characters are different. The stories that are being told are different. And that is fine, right? Like, because they're my stories. Like, Salman Rushdie wrote a book called Haroun and the Sea of Stories, with the idea that all stories in the universe exist in the same place, and we draw from that sea.
Yeah.
And I guess they become interpreted through us, but they all belong to this sea. And I like that idea. I think that's a very poetic idea, but I'm open to, I guess what I should say is I like the idea that I have a certain set of things that interest me. And I'm not afraid if another secret room appears in my story, or a fire, or an older person who has a secret, or any of the elements that have appeared in different forms in previous books of mine. If they reappear, it's more that it makes me curious about why it's back.
Yeah.
And what aspect of it I need to explore. Cause, I am conscious of making each of my books different from the last one. So I don't feel like I'm rewriting the same story.
Yeah.
But I am using elements, and there are elements that I follow when they reappear.
And I really appreciate that. I actually think most of my favorite creative people have these threads that run through things, and almost like you can see pieces of ideas build, just kind of similar to the way that you talked about your early picture books and the robot and the magic and all that. I think that's, I don't know. I always kind of encourage creative people to not be afraid of those things. First of all, because most people won't see most of your work. That's one element. And then the people that are diehard and go back, they're just going to get a kick out of it. They like following the breadcrumbs. One thing that occurred to me as you were talking through that was that, regardless of maybe spirituality, the synchronicities or these coincidences, maybe our sensitivity is heightened when we're trying to do courageous things. And you talking about them showing up when you're creating and writing, that's something that can be an insecure place or a courageous place. And then also people like in this book that are having relationships that they know are secret and could have real consequences. And I wonder if there's almost a feeling of, that this all coming together and these other relationships and history mirroring this and constantly getting this affirmation is really essential to doing things that are scary. And that feels true to me in my real life, is whenever I'm making a big transition or move or something of that nature, I feel like my sensitivity to coincidences goes up, because it's almost the only green flag that we have, or sign that we have. I'd never really thought of it that way till you said that.
Yeah, I think life is chaos as you're moving through it. Things don't make sense. Things happen that you can't control. It's chaos. But when you get through it and you look back, you can make a narrative out of it. You can make a story. Oh, I got to do this because I didn't get to do that thing I was really sad about.
Yeah.
And I thought everything was over and the doors had closed, but it turned out, there's a reason cliches are cliches. Sure. And the idea of a door closing means a window opening. There's versions of that idea that we have thought about. But I think it's because, we as human beings are we're built to tell stories. It's in our DNA for whatever reason, for whatever theory you may have about that. But we make stories happen.
Yeah.
And I've been interested in the ways in which we retell our own stories about the thing that happened to us or the things that happened to us. And that the way we decide to tell the story can affect how we feel about it. You can change how you tell this. Yeah. You can change how you tell the story. And it's the same story, but it can make you feel differently.
It's dramatic.
Yeah. Like, for instance, after when people first started going out again, when the pandemic began to open, I met an artist and I asked her how she was doing, and she said, "Great." And I was like, who the hell says that? And I was like, what? I was like, what do you mean? It was fascinating. And she said, well, I have this really nice studio, and I used to go in and I would just feel bad about my work, but I walked in the other morning and the sun was coming in and it was beautiful. And I had all this work ahead of me that I could do. I didn't know what I was going to do, but I just thought, like, why do I feel bad all the time? I'm going to feel good about what I do. And the fact that I have a nice studio and I can come in and paint what I want. And I said to her, I'm going to do that.
Yeah.
And, and I did. I actually consciously did. And I think it actually made a difference for me. So if you had asked me before that what my process was like, which a lot of people had asked me, that I love talking about my process.
Yeah.
I have told this story. I mean, I've told the story about my process publicly before, and it was always, my process is really hard. I feel bad all the time. And every now and then I have a moment where I figure something out, where I fix a plot point, something comes into focus, and I feel great for a second. But then I dive back into despair because I don't know what happens next. And then after 3 years of pain and suffering, I have a book.
Yeah.
And then I feel good because it's finished. That was my narrative.
Yeah.
And
I
after
can
reading
relate
this,
to the narrative.
yeah. Oh my God. Like, people used to come up to me and be like, thank you so much for talking about the pain. Like, that's how I feel all the time. And I was like, I know. And it's only because it's real. Like, it's like, that is a real thing.
Yeah.
But I began to notice I was living inside of that pain. And I have a nice job. I like my job. I have a nice husband. Like, my house is nice.
Yeah.
I was like, why do I feel bad all the time? Like, why am I making myself feel bad all the time? There's enough things out in the world that, they're to feel bad about. Like, I don't also have to make myself feel bad about myself. So the story I then told myself, and that I now talk about, is my process is, I have these great moments where I have a moment of inspiration. I figure something out, and it feels incredible.
Yeah.
As the story comes together. But those moments often have long periods of pain between them.
Right.
And they often have long periods of frustration between them. But at the end, I know that I should keep going because I'm curious what's going to happen in this story. It's not that I've figured things out in the past. That never really actually seems to help you with the current story. Like, having figured something out before doesn't mean you're going to figure this one out.
Yeah.
But I'm curious about why I'm thinking about it so much. I'm curious about what's going to happen. And then I keep working, and eventually the book is finished and I feel good. And so it's the same story. It's not denying the pain. It's not denying the difficulty, but I have found that by telling the story from that point of view, I feel less bad all the time, so that when I do get into those periods of being stuck and feeling bad, I can think to myself, oh, this is part of my process. Sometimes there is just time.
Yeah.
And I also am working on more than one thing at a time. I'm often working on a drawing for one thing, or an adaptation of one thing, for a different medium at the same time. So I have something I can turn to when I'm stuck in the story. And if I don't, I can take a break, or I can go to a museum, or I can, or sometimes I will just sit and try to figure out the next thing, right? It's not like I'm only writing when I suddenly feel inspired. Sometimes you do have to force yourself into it with an open notebook and a pencil. I find that getting bigger thoughts is easier with pen and paper or pencil and paper. And then going into it in more detail, I transfer everything over to the computer, but I generally start or do big changes with pencil and paper. And usually it's usually present tense lists. Like, the boy goes over here, he does this, she does that.
Yeah.
In order to figure out the changes. But again, like, it's telling the story from your own story from a different point of view that I think can help. And then that can translate to other stories, or it has translated to other stories I would tell about myself. And realizing that some stories aren't actually that fun to tell anymore. And so I don't need to tell them. And other stories, I can figure out ways to tell them that don't then plunge me back into the pain of the story, if it is a painful story. Sometimes it's helpful to think of myself being like a reporter, reporting a story as opposed to feeling it. Because I think a lot of times when we retell our stories, we can also be living them again.
Yeah.
And that I don't always want to do for myself.
Yeah.
But creatively, it has helped me feel less terrible all the time. And I'm appreciative of that.
I love that. I really appreciate you, as you were setting it up. I think subconsciously I'm thinking, oh, this is going to be a dramatic shift from this super negative story to all positive story. And it's really great that you highlight no, the pieces are there. It's just different emphasis, different arc. And it reminds me of one thing that was a breakthrough for me, because when I got into the storytelling side of it, I had that same experience where I'd have these euphoric moments of oh, the metaphor clicked, or, whatever it is. And for a while I felt kind of bad about it because I was like, I know there's so much pain associated with this. Am I doing the wrong thing? Am I just not good at that? But then I really like when that moment happens. And I reframed that as, well, I think it must be if you loved wrestling. If you loved wrestling, part of what you like about it is the pain. That's part of this, sport that you're doing. Right. And this creative sport that I do, a big part of it is kind of hurts. Right. And so I love what you said about that. I want to talk about critique and breaking the form, which I'm sure you've been asked a million times, but I think I want to tackle this hopefully a little bit differently. Because when I think of your work, that's one of the first things I think of is these are really different types of books. And I love what you said earlier. I think a lot about creative stuff as there's this great bit of George Steiner talking about how this fake utopia where there's no critics, and the only critics that exist are people that make their own version of something. So if you didn't like it, you remake it and change what you didn't like. And then he makes an argument for saying the great works of fiction are a critique of the previous work of fiction. I love when you were talking about your taste and sensitivity of moving through this book, loving this book until the magic actually comes into the book, and being I'm going to do one where that never happens. I love that. I think that that's such a good takeaway for people to be able to see that critique and that criticism as a creative prompt. But in that line of thinking, your books are really interesting because they break the form in this really interesting way that I don't have great comparisons to, and that they're highly illustrated and lots of prose. And so I think a lot of people are going to think, oh, these things are just really contrarian to the form. But then when you read them, they also feel very classic. And so I'm wondering if, how do you move through that in terms of, how do you know where to, because like you said, you have these structures that reappear and there's some really classic storytelling things going on. How do you move through? When is it time to break rules? When is it time to, just play by the rules? Do you think about that?
Yeah. And it just has to do with the story.
Yeah.
It's only what does the story demand? And so when I began the invention of Hugo Cabret, it was supposed to be, it was a 98-page novella with one drawing per chapter. That's what my original contract said.
Okay.
And it opened with a 3-page written description of the train station. And I had a sense that each of the drawings that would accompany the chapters would be, have some kind of purpose, although I didn't know what they were yet. But I was just writing the story. But after about a year of writing the narrative and not being able to figure out what each of those drawings, the one drawing per chapter would be, I began to reassess about thinking about what the pictures could do. And somehow, I can't remember exactly how it happened, but I found myself thinking about where the wild things are. I guess maybe because I think about it all the time, but Maurice Sendak's great masterpiece. And if you go back and you look at the structure of that book, of course, it's mostly white space in the beginning with a little rectangle of a drawing. and it says, on the night Max wore his wolf suit, he made one kind of mischief. And then you turn the page and another, and the picture gets a little bit bigger. And every time you turn the page, the pictures get bigger and bigger until by the time you get to the Wild Rumpus, there's no more white space. There's no more words. And it's just 6 pages of moving through these full page bleed illustrations. So you're moving the narrative forward. And then you come back to text after that. And I was thinking about cinema because the story was about George Méliès, who made the first science fiction movie, was one of the pioneers of silent film. So I was watching a lot of movies, looking at films that were made in France in the 1930s when the story took place. And I just somehow eventually made the connection that I could possibly tell part of the narrative with pictures, the way that I'm telling the narrative with words. So I went back and I took out all of the language that I thought I could describe with pictures.
Yeah.
So everything that was actually literally a description I took out. Everything that was movement I took out, because I could show a character on one page doing one thing and then on another page doing the next thing. So I could imply movement. I took out everything that I felt I could draw, which meant I had to leave in dialogue because I knew I didn't want to do speech bubbles like a graphic novel or a comic. I had to leave in sounds. I had to leave in smells, and I had to leave in some thoughts. But I was also able to take out almost all or a lot of emotion because I could show it on the characters' faces. So the 3-page description of the train station that I wrote, which I thought was very nicely written, which involved setting us in Paris, introducing this boy, moving through the train station, became, I believe, 30 pages, 30 drawings, which is 60 pages. I can't remember exactly how long it was now, but where we see the moon over Paris, then we turn the page and we see closer to Paris, and then we see the train station, then we see a boy, then we go into the train station with the boy and we follow him through the crowd, and we get to the metal grate that he climbs through. And so it went from being 3 pages to being, like whatever it is, 60 pages. And and then it also meant that the pictures were appearing randomly throughout the story. So sometimes there was 6 pages of text between 2 drawings, and sometimes there was 1 sentence. So I had to then have a lot of white space between, on the text pages. And that's just technical because that's all the words I wanted between the picture sequences. And then when I finished Hugo and it hadn't been published yet, and I didn't know if anybody was going to read it, I was aware that I had learned a lot of things making the book. So I wanted to take what I learned and then do something new with it for my next book. So I actually started the book that became Wonderstruck before Hugo was actually published. And my idea for the second book was a structural idea before I had a narrative. So it was the opposite of Hugo. My idea for Wonderstruck was to try to tell 2 stories, one in words and one in pictures, have them weave back and forth and then eventually come together. And I coincidentally came upon a documentary about the history of deaf culture, where they talked about how deaf people are the people of the eye because they experience most of the world visually when they can't hear, because they can't hear. Sign language is a visual language. And I thought I could tell the story of a deaf person entirely in pictures because that would parallel the way they experience the world. And then the Marvels became an experiment in memory, where the first half of the book is entirely illustrated, 600 or 300 pages of pictures. And then that story becomes a memory for the characters who seem unrelated in the second half of the story which is told all in text.
Yeah.
So it's not even like the breaking of a structure. It's more the creation of a structure is happening because I know what the story is that I'm telling.
Yeah.
And that's always been what's guided me.
You're trying to find the most effective way to tell that story. And I am super inspired by that. my best-selling book is called Invisible Things. And so I think a lot about what you can show in pictures. And my favorite definition of illustration is writing with pictures. And I love what you described, because when I say that, often I feel like people give me a blank look, like they don't know what I mean. And I'm like, well, you can take a bunch of text that tells you everything about this scene and all of that stuff, and then show a picture. And then you've just written that with a picture. And that's what illustrators, I think, do. And so I love this idea of the categories and Invisible Things are feelings and sounds and smells. And they're all these, it's kind of a flip of that.
Right.
But when you went to go write this notion that you could take out all this text and that the pictures and the text would be telling essential parts of the story, but different parts. Was that something that you intuited, or is it something that you learned? Like I've heard illustrators talk about this, and that being kind of the purpose of having, as you're editing a picture book, that's something an editor is going to talk to you about, or has talked to me about, of like, you don't need to say this, could you show this? Or was this something that you learned in school, or how did you come upon that?
Yeah, it was, I guess it was intuited.
Yeah.
I had become friends with Maurice Sendak right before I started working on Hugo. And it was actually my conversations with him that in many ways led to making the invention of Hugo Cabret, and talking about why, a lot of things that Maurice Sendak has talked about publicly.
Sure.
Which is, why you use pictures, the difference between illustrating and illuminating. That's what he was interested in, was illuminating a story. So you're actually, you're creating a third thing. So there's the pictures, there's the words, and then there's the thing that is created by the combination of the pictures and the words. And that's interesting to me. I've been very, very inspired by the work of Edward Gorey, who's where the gap between what you see and what you read is often extremely wide. Yeah. And you are left as the reader to fill in that giant gap. And what is created in your mind is horrifying and hilarious and often shocking. But he very rarely draws things that are actually shocking. Right. He's drawing the thing that leads up to the shocking moment. He's leading the aftermath of the shocking moment, and he'll indicate the shocking moment in text, perhaps, especially if, the sort of the supreme example of this is the Ghastly Crumb Tinies, where he kills 26 children. Yeah. And you're generally seeing them right before they ingest the ink or are eaten by the bear or fall through, or sometimes just after, I think maybe, we've seen the person just after they've fallen through the ice. But what's being done is forcing you to become complicit in the storytelling, in the murder. You're the one picturing it. He didn't draw it. Yeah. You have to do that. That's wild. And it's sort of like, famously Steven Spielberg had trouble with the mechanical shark when he was making Jaws. And you were supposed to see that shark from the first shot of the movie. But because they were having trouble with the shark, he was forced to find creative ways to imply the shark. Yeah. So when we see the woman be killed by the shark in that extraordinary opening shot, we see her being pulled under. We see her being pushed through the water. We see her rising and falling and being pulled back down. And it's much, much more horrifying because we're imagining what is happening under the water. Yeah. And I think about that a lot. Me too. I think about, like some of my biggest influences are things like The Little Prince, where it's the inside of the elephant, or Walk It in My Pocket, where there's characters you never see. They're like under a rug. Right. Your brain is just like, no, what is that? It's so frightening. I love that. So, okay. I got to respect your time here. And I wanted to tell you, last of all, hopefully, I'm just getting started. I wanted to say massive thanks, because I believe it's through your work that I discovered Remy Charlip, which ended up being one of my biggest influences and influenced that book, Invisible Things. So thank you for that, because I don't know if I would have come in contact with his work otherwise. A lot of people aren't familiar with Remy Charlip. Even in the kids' book world, I'm kind of surprised by
how little he's known in America, at least from my experience.
Yeah, he's fallen through the cracks. He was a very influential writer, dancer, theater maker, really extraordinary person, and intersected with a lot of the great artists in the 50s and 60s in all different fields. And he's now most famous for a book he made called Fortunately, which some people still know.
Yeah.
But one of the things that I feel has become a mission of mine is reintroducing people to Remy Charlip, who made all the books I most loved as a kid, including 13 and Mother, Mother, I Feel Sick, Call for the Doctor, Quick, Quick, Quick. Yeah. Book he did with Margaret Wise Brown called The Dead Bird, which it's one of the great books for children and very young people about death. He's an extraordinary and experimental maker of children's books. He actually ended up posing as George Méliès in The Invention of Hugo Cabret, because I met him right when I was working on Hugo, and he looked just like George Méliès. But he wrote an essay called The Page is a Door about all of the extraordinary things that can happen within a book. And if you want to read that essay, it's on my website, brianselznick.com. There's a section about Hugo. And then in the section about Hugo, there's a section about Remy Charlip.
I just read it and I highly recommend it. It was very inspiring to both my wife and I, who both make picture books together. So
yeah. And he wrote it in the 60s before there was anything like an e-reader or like the, graphic novels that are designed for computers. And he envisions a lot of those things in this essay. He sort of predicts a lot of things a lot of technology that we now have, but he's mostly concerned about what happens when you physically turn the page in a paper book.
Yeah.
And that is, has always been a guiding light to me as well.
And I love the nonsense of, arm in arm. And there's just so much play, and I highly recommend people go check that out. And check out that. I'll put it in the show notes as well.
Yeah, that's great.
What is it called? Every book is a door. Is that what it's called?
A page is a door.
Right, a page is a door. Well, that's excellent. Last thing is there anything that you want to mention about the book, or anything we didn't touch on? I'd hate to leave that out.
Yeah, I will say that Run Away With Me. I'll talk about the plot for a second.
Yeah.
It's about,
we never did get to that.
We never actually got to it. It is about two 16-year-old boys who fall in love in Rome in 1986. It was inspired by a very strange, moment during the pandemic where my husband won something called the Rome Prize, and they somehow got us to Rome 6 days after the insurrection at the height of the pandemic. And we were able to live there for 9 months. And we had the city to ourselves, and I got to go to the Sistine Chapel by myself. I got to go to the Pantheon, the Colosseum, all these places.
Yeah.
Essentially, we were by ourselves. And as I was walking around and talking to other Rome Prize winners, my husband was writing about an Italian architect. Everybody who won the Rome Prize was working on a project about Rome. And I heard about the history of the obelisks and the history of mosaics and the history of churches and excavations and sculptures. And I just kept thinking to myself that all these stories should be in a book. And I created a kind of imaginary map in my head. So when I got back to America, and began to put the story together, I wanted to create a situation that would bring together all my favorite places in Rome. And even when I was there, I began to imagine these two 16-year-old boys falling in love, although I didn't know who they were. Eventually, I decided one would be American, one would be Italian. And then I began to think of other queer love stories through history, one in the 1940s, one in 1900, and one in the 1600s. And it's about the way in which, as queer people, we often don't know we have a history. We're often born into straight families in the straight world. And sometimes it takes us a long time to discover we are part of a culture that dates back to the beginning of time. And I wanted to look at that and look at some moments from that history, because when I learned that history, it gave me a sense of stability, when I was feeling very destabilized, and these are particularly destabilizing times.
Yeah.
And I find that the knowledge of this history, especially when we are currently being faced with an administration that is actively trying to erase us, to know that you can't erase us. People have tried to do it before. They fail. They make our lives worse. They make our lives harder. That is real. but they can't get rid of us.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to look at that in a narrative fashion within the story. And the last thing I'll say, given what we've just discussed, is the book was originally supposed to have no pictures. It was supposed to be my first book with no illustrations. I wanted the words to do what they do in a novel with no pictures, which was paint the images in the reader's mind. So the reader becomes the illustrator. But my editor, David Levithan, felt very strongly that we could probably find a use for pictures. And I think he, was aware that I can draw. So he, thought it might be a good idea to see if we could possibly find a reason.
Yeah.
And even though the book isn't a pandemic book and it's set in 1986, I did want to get across the feeling of what it was like to be in that empty, dreamy version of Rome, which also did have fear and death stalking everywhere because it was the height of the pandemic. So we had the idea to open the book with this walk through an empty, almost empty version of Rome. And I realized as we were thinking up this idea that what would happen is that by the time you got to the text, and unlike Hugo, I didn't take out any of the text I wrote. I essentially kept everything I had written.
Yeah.
But what it meant was when we got to the things we had seen in the pictures, the Pantheon, the elephant obelisk, the the speaking statue where people leave notes, I wouldn't need to describe them very much because we would have already seen them. And for any reader who had not been to Rome, which I knew would probably be most of my readers, the pictures will give you a sense of having been to Rome when you're reading the text, because you'll remember having seen all of those places. And then I should also say that for anybody who goes out and picks up a copy of Run Away With Me, there are also pictures at the very end. So it's bookended by images. But I would suggest, if it's possible, for any reader to not flip ahead and look at the pictures at the end. See if you can wait until you get to them to see what they are, because I think they will work a little bit better. If you do flip ahead, it'll be fine. It won't ruin the story per se. But I enjoy telling people not to look if they can.
Yeah. And I'm glad you ended up adding them because I think they're very effective, especially the back half, I think, does something really incredible. So,
thank you.
Well done. And, a little bit as I'm talking to you, I'm thinking, man, you got to meet Maurice Sendak and Remy. And did you say it's Charlip?
It is actually
saying that wrong
with an SH sound, even though it's CH.
I'm glad I know that now.
Charlotte.
I'm listening to you tell these stories and I'm like, damn it. I wanted to have those experiences. And then I thought, but I'm getting a piece of that, getting to meet you and talk to you. And you're passing that on. It's just an honor to speak with someone with such great work. So thank you so much for doing this. And I hope everybody goes and checks out the book.
Thank you. It was really, really great to talk to you.
Massive thanks to Brian Selznick for this super inspiring chat and very inspiring book. Go check out Run Away With Me wherever you get books. It's gorgeously illustrated. It was an emotional and powerful read. I just thought it had a lot of magic without breaking the realism. It's an incredibly powerful feat, and I really enjoyed it. So thanks for the book. Everybody go check that out. I'm back for our creative call to adventure. This one's called Timepiece. And I wanted to prompt you with some of the themes we were talking about from this episode of seeing yourself not as this isolated thing, but as part of a greater through line, both in terms of your identity and your experiences and your culture, your interests, your style, your influences as a creative person. Like, you are not an isolated event. And so I think it can be powerful to look back through time, back into the past, and see, like, what am I kind of picking up the torch with in my creative work? One of the people that I see as I hope I have some connection to in the work that I do is Jim Henson. And I called this CTA Timepiece because he has a little short film that was really important to his creative development called Timepiece. It's all about time. It's kind of an avant-garde little short film that's really fun and cool. And when I started thinking about like, okay, what is the connection that I have to people like Jim Henson or Tove Jansson, the creator of Moomin? And I think a really big part of what I'm trying to be part of, is this idea that what makes you great is what makes you different, and that what makes you belong is what makes you different, not necessarily what makes you the same. And that we are better off when we have a diversity in our groups and in our families and in our culture, where, from my perspective, I'm really thinking about it in my work. I think diversity is great in all kinds of ways, but I feel compelled by my own neurodivergence and the idea that we're all bringing very different brains to the table, and that's a good thing. And so I think the Muppets and Moomin were a great celebration of that. And I'm happy to be a small part with the books that I make in that kind of lineage. And what I like about that too is I don't need to do everything. I can ask myself, okay, what does that look like in 2025? And that doesn't need to be the end of that journey either. It just needs to be a small part. So it doesn't have to compete with, it doesn't have to conclude that mission. It just has to participate. And so I can take the pressure off a little bit and just do my little part in this day, in the era that I'm making stuff. And I hope that if you think about your influences and you think about what were they doing, what were they accomplishing, what was their mission, and how does that connect to what you're doing today? And also imagine that there will be people coming after you that will pick up that work and finish it or continue it, that you don't need to do all of it here and now. And so I think it's really inspiring to think about the context in which you're making your work as a part of a rich history of people that came before you. So I hope that encourages you and inspires you. Massive thanks again to Brian Selznick for all the time and energy. Love this chat. Huge thanks to Sophie Miller for being an editor and producer on the show and helping me form this episode. Thanks to Connor Jones of Pending Beautiful for audio and video edits, animation, and sound design. Huge thanks to Yoni Wolf and the band Y for our theme song and our soundtrack. And thanks to all of you for listening. Until we speak again, stay pepped up.